Hey, CNFers, we're fewer than 2 weeks away from the publication of The Frontrunner, so be sure to secure yourself a pre-order while supplies last. Call now. But seriously, go to your bookseller of choice and maybe pre-order it. Or order it. It's getting on that time. Go to the independents, not the big A, if you can help it. Also, Wednesday, May 21st, 6 p.m., community run, Pub Day 5K. With Run Hub in Eugene. I guess it's going to be a 3 to 5 mile run. Then at 7 o'clock, we head over to nearby Coalfire Brewing for a book event. And Thursday, May 29th at 7 p.m., I'll be at Powell's Books at Cedar Hills Crossing in conversation with Ruby McConnell. That's in Beaverton in the shadow of the Nike campus. Should be a biggin'. Also, from May 28th to June 1st, the Archer City Writing Workshops at the Larry McMurtry Literary Center are having a workshop called Feature Writing, the Reconstructed Narrative, led by Kim Cross, Hampton Sides, Glenn Stout. Visit lmcmurtrylitcenter.org. No, get that COM out of here. You get your Oregon/events. Let's read that again. lmcmurtrylitcenter.org/events. To learn more, you'll enter the retreat one writer and leave a new one, a better one.
He said, I'll never forget the exact language he used. He said, I don't know how else to put this, comma, but I had a viscerally negative reaction to these pages, period. In short, comma, I feel as if you violated every rule of storytelling.
Oh, Hank, who's on the docket today? Kevin, you got any insight? Lachlan, go back to sleep. We got a Friday matinee here. Looks like it's Will Bardenwerper. I mean, he's got to be a writer, right? Like the Bard is right in the name. It's right there. The Bard. Author of The Prisoner in His Palace, Saddam Hussein, His American Guards, and What History Leaves Unsaid, and most recently, and the occasion that we have to speak with him today, Homestand, Small Town Baseball, and the Fight for the Soul of America. It's published by Doubleday. The story takes us to Batavia, New York, in the western part of the state, not too far from Buffalo. Batavia used to be home to the minor league Batavia Muck Dogs, but was wiped out during Major League Baseball's consolidation of dozens of minor league teams. Not only consolidation, just eradication. And they're getting gobbled up by private equity, Diamond Holdings or something like that. Teams that were often the beating hearts of so many communities. Gone. What took that team's place was a Woodbat College Baseball Summer League, similar to the Cape Cod League, and they were able to adopt the Muck Dogs name. But it's not quite as awash in talent as, say, the Cape League. What separates Will's book from many of these, quote, a season with, unquote, books is that he focuses more on the people in the stands versus the ones in the dugout. The often quirky people who love the game more for what it symbolizes. Because obviously they're not there for, like, high-quality ball, but let's face it, these are good ball players. That wasn't a shot. It's just the truth. A meeting place, and a chance to set aside our differences maybe, to agree on the bang, bang, bang of a 6-4-3 double play. Show notes of this episode and more at BrendanO'Mara.com. Hey, there you can sign up for the monthly Rage Against the Algorithm newsletter. First of the month, no spam, can't beat it. And also the weekly Podstack, which you can find at creativenonfictionpodcast.substack.com. It comes out with every podcast. Sometimes it's a little blurby thing. Sometimes it's just a cache of quotes. I don't know. It's evolving. I think it's worth your time. And that's something I'm very aware of. I know. What a guy. There's also the Patreon crew, where you can elect to join for free to be a wallflower or chip in a few bucks if you want some one-on-one time to talk things through. I post little videos over there, and it's a fun way to get a little something extra. As if you need more from your boy. So Will graduated from Princeton, smart guy, served in the military after 9/11, is the author of 2 books, and has had work appear in the New York Times, Washington Post, Outside magazine, the Denver Post, and more. He enjoys a tough CrossFit workout and probably not eating an entire box of fucking chickpea pasta like I just did before I recorded this. Fucking asshole. You know, I say I want to get in better shape, then I go ahead and do that. Will also likes playing ice hockey and rooting for the Mets, Capitals, and Steelers. Lots of good stuff to chew on, to gnaw on in this conversation. So let's get after it, CNFers. We got a parting shot on learning by doing. So right now, though, we're going to go hear from Will on this double feature Friday.
Because the work I make finds its readers because it is designed for them.
For me, envy is a real sibling to awe.
I'm just a mule.
This is going to have to interest somebody somewhere other than me.
To our conversation would be talking a little bit about the Iron Man, Cal Ripken Jr. He was my favorite player growing up. And,
oh wow!
Yeah, and even though I was a Red Sox fan growing up in exurb, or if you will, of Boston, about an hour south of Boston. Yeah, Cal Ripken was my guy. I wore number 8 in my day, and I was a shortstop primarily. And I love that guy.
Well, there you go. That he was my guy as a kid too. Ever since I can remember, as like a little first grader, on the diamond, I was always number 8, shortstop, same deal.
Yeah, it was. Were you an Orioles fan too?
I was, yes. I grew up outside D.C. in Maryland, and that was before there was a Nationals. And so I grew up an Oriole fan. Subsequently, when I lived in Manhattan, I kind of adopted the Mets in the late '90s. And I've always liked the Orioles, but it was never quite the same. I never had a team that played in the place where I was living until I lived in Manhattan.
And when you played ball and played at Princeton, remind me what your position was.
I was third base, and a little bit of outfield. And I was, unfortunately, primarily JV. I didn't travel, partly as a consequence, I think, of not having been a recruit. I just had to confront the reality that as a walk-on, essentially, you needed to not only be as good as a recruit, you had to be like decidedly better. And I think in some cases I was as good, but I definitely wasn't better. And therefore I didn't quite, flourish there the way I may have wanted to.
What would you identify as a lesson or two that coming up against your abilities in baseball, and reaching the limits of your ambition there, how that translated into your career as a writer?
I don't know if there's any direct lessons I drew from that, other than, I guess, maybe just a general appreciation for how competitive life can be, and how at some point you just have to sort of confront, maybe whatever your limitations may be. For me, that happened in college when I just looked around the diamond, so to speak, and realized that there's probably a few guys out there that no matter how hard I work, I'm not going to be able to hit the ball, 430 feet the way that they can. As a writer, I think, I'd like to think that I've made the most of my ability, but at least it kind of has always served as a reminder that you really do need to work as hard as possible, and that there's always going to be someone else out there who's probably working as hard as you and is probably as talented, if not more talented than you.
Yeah, I when looking towards the end of my playing career, I played a little bit at UMass Amherst, but I was cut my sophomore year. I used the term play very loosely, as I was like redshirted that year with an injury, and then coming back that fall, they had just cut all the red shirts from the year before, and so it was. But I remember my final summer league. I was playing in the Cranberry League in Brockton, and I was kind of burned out on ball anyway. I had long lost the fun of it, and from just that constant trying to get to the next level, to the next level, to the next level. And what I would look across, if I was sitting on the bench for a game, and I would look at the other infielders, and I looked at them, and they were doing better than I was, and I looked at them like, well, they're not going any higher than this level. And if I'm not even at their level, then what's the point for me of even playing? And so I just that was my realization, was kind of like seeing other people that were not that much better than me, and I knew they were not going to get drafted or anything. I'm like, what am I doing here anymore?
Yeah,
So that was kind of my
yeah.
realization.
I can relate, and coupled with that was also the unfortunate reality that I really did not have the world's best coaches. And that plays a large role in it too. And I have two younger brothers, both of whom went on to play in college, and were fortunate enough to have coaches who really were wonderful. And so just sort of watching them and contrasting that with my experience, I was a little envious, and it gave me kind of an appreciation for how important things like that are sometimes, that you have very limited control over.
When you decided to be a writer in this sort of nonfiction milieu, who were some of the inspirations that you drew from that you wanted to model yourself after?
That's a good question, and it's something that I've given a lot of thought to since I did make that decision. And one of the things that I kick myself for, and I know this will resonate with you because I've heard a number of your guests talk about this over the years, which is the fact that I was at Princeton when John McPhee was teaching there. And I mean, the list of McPhee sort of students that have gone on to pursue this career, it's seems like it's endless, and every one of them without fail will point to his influence on them. And I look back and I'm like, I can't believe I was on the same campus and could have taken that class, but at the time it wasn't something that I was really, I don't want to say I wasn't interested in, I just wasn't really aware of. It wasn't on my radar. And so it really wasn't until years after I graduated when I made a career pivot from the military and the defense world into writing that I began to study it sort of in earnest. And when I say study, part of that study entailed things like listening to your podcast, listening to the long form podcast, reading as much as I possibly could from practitioners, and the list of practitioners that I admired or that I read is probably not that uncommon. People like Sebastian Junger, John Krakauer. I mean, kind of some of the same names that you'll hear in these sorts of discussions. But a lot of that was sort of self-taught and just by virtue of kind of just trying to absorb as much as I could from resources like this. And the one thing I really picked up on from that, which might sound contradictory, but the fact that for many of these kinds of questions, it doesn't seem like there really is a right or wrong way of doing things. You'll hear two equally accomplished authors who do things like interviewing completely differently. One might use a tape recorder, one might write, or write notes. And so I just kind of recognized that, and I sort of picked and chose which one seemed to suit me the best, and went from there.
Yeah, what are some of the things that you've cherry picked from other people that you have accessed in your utility belt?
Well, I think one is just the confidence that comes from recognizing that there really doesn't seem to be a right or wrong answer. I think maybe had I not listened to a lot of what some of these other writers had to say, I would have been afraid that I was, quote, doing it wrong, but it kind of reassured me, wait a second, some of the foremost practitioners do things in very different manners, and yet the outcome in the form of what they produce is still equally good. And so I think there was a confidence that came from just recognizing that fact. For example, to use the interview example, which people talk about a lot, I think partly because of the kind of writing that I do, where I'm spending days, weeks, months with people, it just wouldn't be practical to have a recorder out that entire time, because then I'd get back to my hotel room with 8 hours of of recording, and what good is that? What I do is I usually just have a notebook and a pen, and the first few days I'm spending with someone, it might be a little awkward, but over the course of time, it just becomes, I think, just kind of an understood thing that I'm doing. I don't know. I think we get to the point where they barely notice. And then what I'll do is I'll just take notes periodically over the course of the time we're together. And then that night I'll usually sit down while it's still fresh and try to type it up into something coherent. I think you had a guest on, I can't remember who it was, but he was saying how he would be in the car driving and trying to just kind of listen to the conversation and remember it. And as soon as he'd get to a red light or something, he'd quickly pull out a notebook and try to write it down as quickly as he could. And my technique is not entirely dissimilar from that.
Yeah, that was Darcy Frey,
That's right. Yeah.
author of The Last Shot. I was
Mm-hmm.
blown away at what he was able to capture, and like how he was able to scribble that stuff down and fill up these volumes of notebooks. And I love that ideal, but I find that I just can't capture everything, or I can't. My penmanship is such that I can't keep up, and then I can't read it, and that means I lose it.
Mm-hmm.
And it's so I tend to lean on the recorder as much as I wish I didn't have to.
I know those are all challenges that I've dealt with: the handwriting, the feeling like you might miss something.
Yeah.
And there's no getting around the fact that it sometimes will seem obtrusive, whether it is a recorder or a notebook. And so just kind of doing the best you can to not let that sort of interfere with the natural flow of the conversation.
And as you were developing your skills as a writer, what did you find? We were talking about limitations a while ago. Like, what did you find that you struggle with, that it doesn't come as naturally for you?
I would say that I don't know if this is directly answering your question, but I think sometimes I have a tendency to become preoccupied with the mechanics of writing and the construction of each sentence and making sure that those are done kind of as well as humanly possible. I don't want to say to the detriment of, but without maybe spending a commensurate amount of time thinking through kind of where this will all fits kind of in the overall narrative arc of the story, so kind of like you don't want to become, and I'm not saying I go to this extreme, but you don't want to become sort of paralyzed with wordsmithing at the expense of the actual overall design of the story you're trying to tell, if that makes sense.
Yeah, when does the shape of a narrative start to reveal itself to you?
Well, that's one of the challenges, I think, of the kind of writing that I do. And one of the questions that publishers will often ask is, okay, what's the arc of the story? And of course, it can be a challenge to definitively answer that when you are doing sort of an immersive, season in the life of such and such story, because you don't, by definition, you don't know how the season's going to end,
Yeah.
And so, what I will generally try to explain is, okay, listen, like, we don't know how this story is going to end, but I've spent enough time studying this and getting to know these people that I can tell you without hesitation that there will be no shortage. Like in the case, I'm thinking of this story I did on Indian relay racing on the Pine Ridge Reservation in South Dakota, this sport that these young Native Americans participate in. That just on its own, it's an incredibly exciting sport, but it also delivers them, I think, a deeper meaning and confidence and discipline and happiness that helps them sort of overcome any number of challenges that come with living on this reservation. So I wanted to do a story that was going to basically be like a season in the lives of these Native Americans on Pine Ridge. And so one of the questions that the editor had is, okay, well, what's the arc? And I can say, well, I don't know if they're going to win the championship or come in dead last, but unfortunately, I can tell you that there is going to be significant adversity in the form of, the impact of substance abuse on their loved ones, the suicide epidemic, just the general poverty that defines their lives. While I can't tell you how it's going to end, I can kind of tell you the sorts of issues that they're going to have to grapple with, that I think are very important and that would make for a powerful story.
What stories or central figures do you find yourself most drawn to?
I mean, I think my answer here is probably generally similar to what a lot of creative nonfiction writers would tell you, which is just trying to identify sort of representative yet colorful, real people whose lives can kind of help shed light on larger societal issues. I don't think that answer is necessarily earth-shatteringly unique, but I mean, I think that is the sweet spot. So you're not just writing sort of about abstract policy issues in like a wonky sort of academic way, but you're also not asking the reader to join you for 20 hours learning about the life of someone, whose experiences may have just, little that they can sort of learn from or reason to immerse themselves in for that period of time. So I mean, I think that's maybe what a lot of writers in this field gravitate towards, and I'm one of them.
Yeah, I know, for speaking from my experience, I'm kind of drawn to central figures of very singular vision and ambition and focus.
Mm-hmm.
Namely because it's something I lack, and I deeply admire that in people who like bodybuilders or something. Like, sure, like we can speak to how kind of like maybe gross their physiques are, and because they're just so maximal. But I really admire the dedication that it takes to reach a high level, be it a basketball player, baseball player, bodybuilder. And I find myself drawn to them because I think I lack that myself. And do you find that similar with you? Like, sometimes some of the people you're attracted to are like, they kind of have something I admire.
Maybe, and I think another maybe thing that draws me to someone is, and this gets to a quote that one of the people I'm writing about said this, and I Googled it because it seemed like something that someone else famous must have said, but I couldn't find anyone else to attribute it to. But he said something along the lines of, every life is a novel. We just don't take the time to read most of them. And I think that that's something that I found insightful. The idea that you can really look into most people's lives and experiences and find a lot there, if you just spend a little time getting to know them. I think there was a book written by, I think he was maybe a Washington Post reporter, I can't remember who it was, but he kind of had the same idea, and he spent time, I think he said, I want to get to know everyone that lives on my street. Because he had basically said, listen, I get up every morning, I go to bed every night, and I see these people for 30 seconds a day or whatever, but I couldn't tell you two things about them, but yet they're all living lives that are full of just as much heartache and joy and everything as everyone else. And I'd like to it'd be interesting for me to kind of try to discover some of that. And he just literally went with a notebook and knocked on their doors and introduced himself and said, would you mind, having me stop over and getting to know you over the course of the next few months or whatever the case may be. In the book, I think one or two of them probably said, no, we're not interested in doing that. But the others did. And it was remarkable, the stuff that he discovered about people that lived in some cases, 2 houses away, that he never would have known had he not taken the time to find out.
Yeah, I love that. I think maybe younger writers, I know I was probably susceptible to this too, like to feel like you needed to write a big story, you needed to go to some big place. You had to go to a big country and a big and it had to be a heavy lift like that. But these backyard narratives. I mean, Tracy Kidder made a career out of these backyard narratives, and to the example you cite, like the things aren't. You don't have to go to Nepal to find a brilliant story. It could be literally next door.
And we are becoming such a, it's so much of our media attention and journalistic attention and entertainment attention is focused on, a few cities, and even within those cities, like a small sort of slice of celebrity life. And it's just, I think it would be wonderful if there, and this isn't, I don't think there's any shortage of enterprising writers out there who would be willing to do it, but it's just hard to find someone to pay you to do some of these stories. But it would be wonderful if we had more opportunities for more people to do that kind of reporting on areas that are otherwise kind of overlooked.
And what are some of your favorite books that chronicle a season in the life of, that were, basically comp titles to Homestand?
There's I think it's called The Last Best League, maybe, that was written about the Cape Cod League a number of years ago. That was a really good one. I mean, there's going back further, there's sort of the seminal books like John Feinstein's Hoosiers.
Season on the Brink,
Season. I'm sorry, not Hoosiers. Season on the Brink. Yeah, A Good Walk Spoiled, another one of Feinstein's books about the PGA Tour. Those, that's not like the only kind of narrative nonfiction that I've read or that has influenced me. But I guess as far as like the providing kind of the skeleton for a book, that is the approach that I took.
Yeah, it's amazing how Homestand, it made me really not like Major League Baseball. And I was struggling with professional sport, as a major umbrella anyway for a while, and then when you see how the commodification trickles down to these mom and pop, what were used to be mom and pop minor league teams, it really paints a sour picture of professional sport.
No, it does. I mean, that's a very real negative outcome that this entire project had on me. And obviously, I know I had a sense of some of these things going in. That's one of the reasons I pursued it in the first place. But I think just recognizing some of the, I don't want to say toxicity or corruption, but just recognizing basically and I allude to this in the book, but the disconnect between sort of the Norman Rockwell, Americana, sort of field of dreams image that baseball has traditionally used to market itself. And then kind of seeing behind the curtain at how things, at the decisions that are really being made and how they're often at odds with that image was, profoundly disillusioning. And as someone who's been a fan of the sport for my entire life and who has a young son who I'd love to also be a baseball fan and go to games with, it leaves a bitter taste in your mouth, and it leaves you feeling very conflicted. I don't really want to spend my hard-earned money supporting an enterprise that does this, but at the same time, if you don't, you're really just punishing yourself, because it's not going to make a dent in Steve Cohen's wallet, whether or not I go to a Mets game, or a Pirates game where I live now. I mean, the Field of Dreams game is actually a great example that I refer to in the book, where they stage this game once a summer out in Iowa, and it's a TV hit. The ratings are through the roof. Everyone loves it. But if you step back, you're like, well, the people in the stands are mostly rich coastal people that fly out there for this one game. The tickets are exorbitantly expensive. They try to earmark a few for the locals, but those sometimes get sold on the secondary market to, for 10 times what they're worth. And yet, at the same time, they eliminated 2 minor league teams just down the road in Iowa. So, okay, where does that actually leave their grassroots supporters who had been going to these games all summer long? They have no team anymore. And yet, it's great for them. There's one game over the course of the summer that they can't even afford. But, the way that MLB would pitch that is that this is a tremendous success, celebrating the history of the game. And so it's just things like that just seem to me to be very sort of hypocritical. And it was kind of hard. Once your eyes have been open to that, it's hard not to kind of see it everywhere.
Yeah, in the intro, you're right. Bottom line, this is big business, and that's no secret. But like that, but the fact that it's now run, like you write, like a Wall Street boardroom where you pursue assets, like that is it has become so optimized and commodified in that way, where it is almost clinical and dispassionate. It's really unsettling.
No, you're right. And I mean, there were so many rabbit holes I could have gone down when you get into the business of baseball. And it took a lot of discipline to determine, okay, I mean, this is important to the story. I don't want to ignore it because it provides valuable context, but I also don't want to lose readers who aren't necessarily as interested in that. And so, there were the evolution of talent evaluation and development. Basically, what is the role of the minor leagues? What did it used to be? What is it now? What does the future portend? You could write an entire book on that. But at the same time, I didn't want to have characters I introduced on page 3 and then take a 50-page detour, dissecting the business of baseball before I reintroduce those characters. And by then, everyone would have forgotten who they were in the first place. So, it took a lot of discipline and sort of strategizing to figure out, okay, what do I think the reader needs to know? And then how much of that can I include without distracting people?
Yeah, I didn't realize that there was this Diamond Baseball Holdings buying up minor league properties as an investment portfolio, basically. And yeah, I had no idea. That really surprised me. I didn't realize it had come to that, where a conglomerate can basically gobble up teams to have all these assets to try to kick up to the majors. I don't know. I didn't know that.
And that part, again, that's another one of those areas that would have been worthy of further investigation. But it just didn't pass the smell test to me, in that the person who kind of orchestrated that had been a minor league owner who then got paid by Major League Baseball to consult and advise on contraction. So essentially helping decide which 40 teams are we going to get rid of? Oh, how many are we going to get rid of, and which ones are they going to be? And then as soon as he finished that, he jumped ship and started up his own investment company to buy the surviving teams, the teams that had escaped the scythe that he had been wielding. And now they've amassed, they started at 0 and now they're at, I think, over 40, which is, a large percentage of the 120 total. So, and I just, didn't have really the resources or the bandwidth to do like a deep dive investigation into what was going on behind closed doors and what led to that. But I knew enough about it to know that this just doesn't quite feel right. And more importantly, I don't think this is going to bode well for the future of the minor leagues, because I think what you're probably going to see, this is kind of best case scenario. Worst case scenario is even worse. But I think best case, there's going to just be a degree of sort of homogenization. I think one of the professors I spoke to of sports business called it the Home Depotization of minor league baseball, where it was kind of the whole P.T. Barnum, back road America story, which is what made it kind of special in the first place. You go to a game in rural Georgia, it's going to look different from one in Coney Island or whatever. But because each one was owned by, generally speaking, by like a mom and pop owner that was from that community. Now, if it's owned by a distant investor in New York or LA, are they going to start making decisions? Well, okay, this seems to be a promotion that's working great down in Texas. Let's try it up in Minnesota, and all of a sudden, kind of this regional, allure that minor league baseball has had historically is, you run the risk of that getting lost. That's best case. I think worst case, you just start seeing more teams get cut, if their profits start looking like they're in jeopardy, or we've seen kind of what private equity has done to other industries that they've taken a big stake in, like newspapers, for example, and it oftentimes does not end well for those local businesses.
Now, a lot of books that follow a season, more often than not, focus on the players, and you do to some extent, but you spend most of your attention with just the quirky fans of the community, the owner, and to the manager too gets quite a bit of real estate as well. So I wanted to get a sense of the decision you were going into to focus on the butts in the seats versus the ones in the dugout.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's right. I think if you were to just look at the word count, for example, that was devoted to what was going on the field versus off the field, you'd probably find something like a 80-20 ratio in favor of off the field. And that was intentional, I think, for a few reasons. One is that the book I always had kind of envisioned it as a vehicle to kind of tell this bigger story of what these teams mean to these communities, kind of the ballpark as a civic asset, as a third place for people to come together and find happiness, especially in these sort of very partisan times, at an affordable price, which helps distinguish it from major professional sports. And there's other elements that also distinguish it that I think are important that maybe we could get into later. So, I mean, that was always the intent. It was never, I think, to tell the story of how the 2022 Batavia Muck Dogs finished in the Perfect Game Collegiate Baseball League. I mean, that was a useful mechanism to use to help tell that bigger story. But so therefore, I spent probably 6 out of every 9 innings in the bleachers getting to know the people whose lives were so caught up in following this team, and then maybe 3 innings in the dugout with the players and the manager, because I did want there to be enough sort of baseball action, so to speak, to kind of help propel this story forward. And that, after all, was what was bringing the people to the ballpark in the first place. So it wouldn't make sense to ignore it entirely. But that was never really, which of these players was going to get drafted or how the team was going to finish. That was really never going to be my overall focus.
Yeah, and early on in the book too, you write that you're a veteran who served overseas, and you're right. After fighting alongside fellow young Americans taking on a real enemy that was trying to kill us, it was depressing to see how many Americans back home saw the opposing political party as the existential threat that needed to be vanquished by any means necessary. So, as someone who really did, put your life on the line, and then coming back and seeing that, like how I don't know, disorienting an experience was that for you, as you articulate in this book too.
Yeah, it was disorienting. Luckily, I was not ever personally impacted by kind of the traditional manifestations of PTSD, as far as waking up in the middle of the night with flashbacks or things like that. But I was bothered, probably more than maybe some folks who hadn't served, just with this idea that coming home to a country that seems so broken in so many ways, and thinking to yourself, is this really what, yeah, I had quit my job after September 11th to serve. And I think I had this sort of idealistic notion of what America at least sort of meant or represented to me. And then you come home and it just doesn't really resemble that. And that was sort of just a source of sort of persistent frustration. And in the ballpark, I found a place that just seemed to exude kind of a serenity that was that you couldn't help but sort of fall for. And I think I was sort of looking for that in my own life, and I think a lot of other people there, certainly they weren't all veterans, but I think everyone has challenges in their lives that they're looking to either distract themselves from or to somehow get past or escape. And I talk about a few of them in the book, and I think all of them kind of discovered something at Dwyer Stadium that kind of transported them to a better place and away from some of the more challenging elements of their lives. I talk about a Vietnam veteran, and his experience may be more closely mirror mine in that he was a veteran. But I talk about other people, who had lost loved ones or who had lost jobs or were suffering really difficult economic circumstances. I mean, the towns that I write about are not particularly well off, and that's again what drew me to the story in the first place. I just kind of had this intuitive sense that the last thing that these 40 cities need, many of which had already been struggling, is to kind of have this one source of happiness that could bring them together extinguished, by the same sort of economic forces that had already taken so much from them over the course of the last 20 years.
Yeah, what did embedding in Batavia just teach you about Rust Belt communities and maybe writ large the state of the country in 2022 through now?
Well, I found them to be tremendously welcoming, which I don't want to say was surprising, but anytime you show up somewhere with like a notebook and you say, I'm here to write about you, I think you naturally can expect maybe some degree of at least hesitation. But I found them to be, just wonderfully welcoming, friendly, almost grateful that someone was taking the time to spend there. And making the effort to kind of tell this story about something that was so meaningful to them. But it also did drive home. And I live in Western Pennsylvania, which is not entirely dissimilar from Batavia in certain regards, in that there are no shortage of sort of smaller towns that have suffered from deindustrialization. You drive down Main Street and 3 out of 4 businesses are closed, and the other ones that are open, it's like a vape shop or a liquor store or a tattoo parlor. They're just places that haven't been flourishing for a while. And relative to some of those towns, Batavia is actually doing pretty well. I think they may be undergoing a bit of a renaissance. There's 2 new brew pubs. There's some nice coffee shops I talk about. There's kind of a little bit of an underground art movement taking root. I think hopefully they're maybe beginning to emerge from this downturn, but certainly not all of their neighbors are similarly benefited.
Yeah, and how important was it to the people you were covering that you were taking the time, embedding with them for weekends at a time, and not just helicoptering in.
Sure. That's something that I'm very sensitive to. And I think I learned a lot on that from that story I did out on the Pine Ridge Reservation, because that community in particular has suffered just numerous times from what they would call poverty porn, where you have, in their eyes, some rich person from a city, because, relative to them, most of the reporters coming in there would be rich, even though we're not. As anyone who works in the freelance journalism business, we are by no means rich, but relative to one of the poorest parts of America, we are. And so what would happen is these reporters would come there. They would maybe spend 2 days. They'd gravitate to the worst possible corner of the reservation, take pictures of the most sensationally, awful things they could find, and then they'd leave and they'd write a story about how terrible this place was. And understandably, the people that live there would say, okay, well, how in the world do we benefit from this? Just you coming in, not even learning who any of us are, and then leaving and broadcasting these images to the world. Not that we don't have our problems, and not that wasn't real, but is that really capturing the whole truth, so to speak, of who we are as a people? And so what in the course of researching that story, I said, listen, the best I can do is just promise you that I'm not going to do that. I will spend lots of time out here, probably more time than you even want me to. You're going to be sick of me being out here. And so, at a minimum, you have that commitment from me. And I think that made a big difference in just kind of winning some degree of trust that that you're going to put in the time. And then when it came time to publish that story, I said, listen, I can't overlook some of those unfortunate realities of life here, because the whole point of the story is how this sport why the sport is important to begin with. And one of the reasons for that is how it helps people overcome some of these challenges. If I don't highlight the challenges, then the sport is less significant and less meaningful. And so, ultimately, I think I struck the right balance there, in that I managed to I think, tell the truth about, the good and the bad. Similarly, in Batavia, I think having had that experience on the reservation, I kind of tried to employ the same approach, where I said, I'm not going to try to come in here, like you said, parachute in, go to one game, talk to 5 people, and then leave. I'm gonna really try to, as best I can, to get to know you, to get to know the community, and get as good of an understanding of sort of the rhythm of life here as I can.
I was particularly struck by and amused by your interactions with Eric. The way he would get under your skin, I found like really relatable by someone who is just a pretentious guy who's just like doesn't think much of your art, but like definitely thinks much of his.
Yeah, what did he say? He said, don't take this the wrong way, but what you do is not art.
Yeah.
Because you're not creating something from nothing, implying that, because that's what I do, in other words.
Yeah.
So yeah, I'd like to think I did the best I could, and I think this comes across in the pages to kind of give him the benefit of the doubt and get along with him. But there's just some people that no amount of diplomacy is going to overcome whatever.
And I'm going to punch in right here, not to interrupt, but after Will and I were done, he shared a really telling anecdote about getting feedback and persevering in the face of kind of brutal feedback. And I feel like this is a good place to insert it. This is a moment where Will shares this experience of getting pretty savage feedback and then persevering in the face of that. I think this is a germane point to put this part into the show.
Sure. So just to kind of put it in context, I had just left what had been a good job at the Pentagon, and one that I had enjoyed, in pursuit of this idea that I was gonna write a book. And so, it wasn't completely unplanned. I had spoken to an agent who had then, put me in touch with a publisher. And at that point, I had secured a book deal. But still, I had, a pretty limited body of work. Nonetheless, I set out with the intention of writing this book, and I put together what I thought were 40 of the most wonderful pages I had ever written. And because he had said, hey, why don't you get started? Send me, your first few chapters, and we'll just do an azimuth check and kind of see how you're doing. And so I worked on these night and day, and I was really proud of what I had produced. I sent it in. This is a pretty prominent editor at a prominent publishing house. I was probably, one of his, if not probably one of his least distinguished authors at that point. Anyway, so he takes it and reviews it and sends me back this attachment. It was actually an email, but with like a 7-page document attached on, the publisher's letterhead. And so I double click on it. I open it up, and it just says, "Dear Will." He said, I'll never forget the exact language he used. He said, "I don't know how else to put this, but I had a viscerally negative reaction to these pages, period. In short, I feel as if you violated every rule of storytelling." So you can imagine. Oh my God. And I'm sitting at my desk, in my apartment, having just walked away from this job, to take this leap, into the unknown world of writing. And here I have this prominent editor basically telling me that I'm terrible at this. And it was tough. I mean, as any writer knows, there's something, you're sort of vulnerable when you put yourself out there on the page. And I had been to Army Ranger School. I had subjected myself to all kinds of sort of physical torments over the years, but this is kind of a unique vulnerability that I think you assume in this profession. And to have someone, that candidly tell you that you fell short was not easy. And so it took me a few days, I'm sure, to kind of lick my wounds and get back up off the ground. And after that first paragraph, he actually went on for 6 more pages to kind of highlight in detail all of the areas in which I had come up short in his estimation. And looking back on it now, and even at the time, I began to understand what he was saying. And what he was really telling me was not so much that I was a bad writer. It was just the wrong kind of writing. And so what I was doing, I think, was too much of sort of the grad school / op-ed kind of writing that I had done prior to that point, prior to trying to write this book of narrative nonfiction. And I wasn't telling a story. And that's basically what he was trying to communicate to me. This isn't bad writing. It's just not what we're looking for. We're not making an argument. We're not trying to necessarily convince the reader of something. We're trying to tell a story and then allow them to connect the dots and emerge from that. At that point, maybe enabling them or empowering them to emerge from that with their own lesson, or at least guiding them to that point less overtly. To use an example, and I wasn't this bad, but this is kind of an oversimplified version of what I was doing wrong. I would chronicle, or tell the story of like 4 murders that Saddam Hussein was responsible for. And then I would conclude that by saying, this shows just what a bad guy Saddam really was, and he's like, trust the reader. If you do a good enough job of telling the story of what he did, they're smart enough to conclude that he's not a nice guy. You don't need to then beat them over the head with this editorial voice to connect every dot. And so, at the end of the day, thankfully, I was able to change course after 30 pages rather than 300 pages and keep that advice in mind as I wrote the rest of the book. And I think the rest of the book, the way the book turned out, would reflect, well on his guidance and on my ability to incorporate that into my writing.
Yeah, but the phrase of a viscerally negative reaction, like, I don't know, that is you're down on the mat and you might not get up.
It was borderline, sadistic, I think. I mean, he didn't have to do it that way. And some of your listeners may have worked with this particular editor. I'm sure when I say this, one or two of them are like, "Oh my God, I know who that is," because I think he is pretty notorious for lack of a bedside manner in so many words. And I've talked to other of his writers who have told me, I wasn't the only writer actually that he delivered a message like this too. But at the same time, he was workaholic, tremendously talented. And I think the book absolutely benefited. I mean, 9 out of the 10 things that he suggested I ended up agreeing with, trying to do. And I think the book was better as a result. And I find myself, even today, I'll go back to some of his editorial letters and just sort of reminding myself of those lessons, and applying them to my work today.
Yeah. And I mean, naturally, when you hear that degree of feedback, it does a lot to your confidence in you. I imagine you were just dealing with a lot of doubt at that point. And to your credit, you dusted yourself off and proceeded. But take us to that doubt that you inherently felt in that moment, but maybe even some of the doubt that you feel today, given that you're 2 books in. It doesn't really go away ever.
No, you're right. You're right. I mean, I think you have less of it. The more times you've kind of proven yourself, the more confidence I think you have, and the more other readers and critics have hopefully sort of validated your work. You develop confidence that, hey, like, if these people are telling me it's not bad, it's probably not bad. Whereas that time it was literally like my first or my second, I guess, if you were to include my agent, professional reader telling you it's bad, you're like, oh, maybe it is, maybe it is bad. And so, but no, that doubt never goes away. And I think it comes back to that point of there is something about the writing process. I think particularly in this kind of writing that we're talking about, that, and to the extent that you insert yourself into the story, maybe even more so, like with this most recent book, where you're exposing things that can be, either uncomfortable, or you're showing the world something that can be, that there's a vulnerability associated with that, and exposing that for sort of the world to see, and then to hear people come back to you and say, you didn't do it right. I think that is tough for any writer to kind of internalize.
Yeah, the idea that when you're getting feedback that they're being critical of the work and not you, but when you are in the work, it can be very much harder to discern the difference between the two. And it's like, okay, no, they're not criticizing me as my ability as a writer, but like this is a wholly different thing that is taking on the feedback. And like the best editors and the best readers are the ones who will be like, yeah, like if especially my wife is kind of like this. If she doesn't say she likes something, or she only points out what she doesn't like. If she doesn't say anything else, it's like, that's cool, that's good. And you have to kind of learn, kind of like the love language of a particular writer. Be like, it's all right to give a little bit of a compliment, because we're kind of fragile people.
Yeah. But at the same time, I think that experience did harden me and toughen me in a way that's valuable, because now I think it made me recognize the value of a good editor, because I looking back on that now, I'm like, you know what, as miserable as that was, and as horrible as I felt for, a period of time, I wouldn't do it over again, because I'm proud of this book. He was right. And the book is better as a result. And that was a good, if it meant I had to be miserable for a month, I'd rather do that than have the book come out and be less good than it could have been had he not shared that with me. So I think in a certain way, it strengthened me, in that it illustrated to me the value of having a good editor, and the fact that a good outcome is worth some degree of pain along the way.
A couple weeks ago, I had spoke to him in December, but finally ran the podcast like a couple of weeks ago. It was John Gliana. He's just a journalist, and he followed. He wrote No Friday Night Lights, and he brought up on the show, because kind of like his favorite part of his day as a writer, and it came up in a Facebook group or something he was talking to, and some people were like, "Oh, on Pub Day," and he tongue in cheek is just like, "Oh, when I win my Pulitzer Prize." But his thing was, getting up early, getting that first hot cup of coffee, and like rereading a few words from the day before, and then getting after it again. And it was like a really good sentiment. And so I say that as a table setter for you, Will. Just like, where do you feel alive and like engaged in this whole mess that we've gotten ourselves into?
Well, I'll tell you what it's not, and that's staring at an empty, or a Word document that has nothing on it. That's what I absolutely hate, and triggers quite a bit of anxiety. So that process of kind of starting from scratch. I think what I enjoy and this may be consistent with other writers, but what I enjoy is further down the road where you look at pages that you've finished or are nearing completion on, and you actually can sort of sit back and be like, wow, that's actually pretty good. And it may take a while to get to that point, and it probably does take a while to get to that point. But when you can finally look at something with some degree of confidence that this actually turned out pretty well, and I'm going to make a few tweaks here and there, but I'm almost to the point where I can hit send, and send it to my editor and be pretty confident that this is not going to generate the response that they're going to have something more than a viscerally negative reaction to what you just sent them. I think that's where there's a degree of satisfaction. And then finally, just actually, hearing back from readers in response to something that has been published and hearing how what you wrote resonated in their lives. There's nothing more gratifying than that.
Yeah, that's great. When that happens, you're like, because it's such a solitary thing by and large, doing this and working in nonfiction. Yeah, we do interface with people for the most part, doing reporting and stuff. But yeah, ultimately it is by yourself, a lot of solitude. Even doing the podcast, a lot of times it's kind of just like me on mic, and then it's like me and you. But it also feels it's just me in my little studio here, and it does feel kind of lonely. And so then when you do get that feedback from people, you're like, oh wow, it's landing on someone and connecting with someone, and that there's some juice there too. And
just the opportunity to get to, when you step back to the research and the reporting phase of these projects, and there's more of that in some than others, but when you actually do get out into the real world and you meet real people and you get to know them, and in many cases become friends with them. And I know that can be challenging in its own right, because it can kind of blur the lines between them as source, / subject versus, friend. But I think it's almost inevitable that if you're spending dozens, if not hundreds of hours with someone, you're in many cases, you're going to get to know them pretty well, and you may start to like them. And there's something cool about that too, because in many cases, these are parts of the country that you may not have spent time in. These people are engaged in jobs that you may not be particularly familiar with before you started the project. And that's just always, I think, there's always something kind of fresh and invigorating about that.
Over the course of the however many months you spent there, and you probably have lots of other conversations with people that didn't necessarily make the audition maybe for the book. So what was it about the people, the primary people, that you chose to really latch on to that spoke to Batavia and your vision for Homestand?
Well, I can't underscore enough, I think, the importance of the fact that the person who introduced me to this whole project, Bill Kaufman, is an accomplished writer in his own right. And the way this whole thing materialized was he had read a piece I did in Harper's Magazine on the death of the Appalachian League. He just wrote to me from my website and said, "You're not going to believe it. I read your article. I loved it. Everything you said about this league, it resonated so much. It reminded me so much of this team that we had that was also eliminated. Can I buy you a beer? I'd love for you to come up here and just talk baseball." And at the time, I still am living in Pittsburgh. It's about 4 hours away. I said, sure. And I drove up there, got to know him, had a Guinness. We talked. He talked about the Muck Dogs. He introduced me to some of his friends. And then I thought to myself, well, this is the story. It's the death, but then the rebirth of baseball in this community in this other form of this collegiate woodbat league, kind of filling the void that had been left behind when Major League Baseball canceled these teams. But I think, to get back to your question, having another writer kind of turned me onto the project helped, because writers sort of just intuitively know what makes for a good story. And he happened to know a number of people up there that were just tremendously sort of colorful in their own right, that happened to be friends of his. And so rather than, I didn't just show up at the ballpark on day one and just start introducing myself to random fans in the hopes I'd meet someone interesting. I had a little bit of a head start, because Bill had already introduced me to some of the people he knew, many of whom were extremely interesting, probably because he is, and people like that tend to, hang out with each other. And so, for example, he helped introduce me to Betsy Higgins, one of the women I write about, who is she lives in Buffalo. She and her friend Ginny would drive an hour each way all summer long to these games, and they're not even sports fans, which is what made it even more ironic. They just love the aura and the atmosphere of the ballpark, and that was their thing that they do during the summer. But she, loves Thomas Hardy, so we would find ourselves talking, and she had an enormous rare books library in her home in Buffalo, so I would just hang out with her. We'd talk books. There was a retired teacher named Ernie Lawrence who would put together little rosaries in the bleachers as he watched the games. Another just really, really thoughtful, cerebral, contemplative guy whose company I really grew to enjoy. And the list kind of just goes on of these people that I met who just had very rich sort of inner lives and had really interesting experiences that they would share with me. And, I think that again accounts to what you were saying as far as the amount of time I ended up spending in the bleachers with talking to them as opposed to in the dugout watching the game.
Yeah. How did you navigate or maneuver around the stadium, when it came, when it was game time and you were reporting and deciding where to perch?
That was one of the bigger challenges, honestly, as you could probably imagine, but you might not be able to totally imagine it until you were to see me trying to do it, because it could be awkward in that I would only be there, of course, for the length of the game. I'd spend time with these people, of course, like we'd go get coffee or go to dinner, but the game's only 9 innings long, and there's only one of me, and the game's not going to stop to allow me to do my reporting. And so I had to be very strategic, almost sort of cold-bloodedly so, knowing that I as wonderful of a conversation as I may be having about Dostoevsky with Betsy Higgins, I can't have a 5-inning conversation about it because the game's going to be over and I will have lost the opportunity to talk to the 5 other people that I wanted to talk to. It was a little awkward because you wanted to be social. You didn't want the people you're spending time with to think you're just kind of desperately mining them for information as quickly as possible before you had to leave to talk to someone else. But at the same time, you did need to be deliberate about it, because you're not just there to have a beer and talk. You are there to gather material for a book that you're trying to write. And the two can bleed into each other, because these did sort of evolve into real friendships, which almost made it more difficult, because it would be hard to say, okay, I really got to go now, as much as I'm enjoying this conversation, because I got to talk to these other 6 people. And by the way, I need to be taking notes on how the game's actually going because I'm writing about the game. Fortunately, the games were broadcast on YouTube and taped. And so I could go back and watch the YouTube broadcast of the game to kind of help connect the dots. If I missed like a double play here or a home run there, and I could talk to the players the next day. And if I needed someone to remind me about, who got what hit or, things like that to help fill the gaps of the actual game. But no, it was a challenge to try to, in a very condensed amount of time, talk to all the people that I felt like I needed to talk to, and then to put it together in the book in a way that came across as being at least a little bit seamless.
Yeah, there was a charming amount of for love of the game aspect to the team, because this isn't exactly the Cape League for baseball. This is the final stop along the road for many of those players, even managers. I mean, even the announcer who does everything pretty much pro bono on YouTube, like, probably deserves a shot at something more professional. But here is someone just doing this for the sheer love of it. And I found that, I don't know, just kind of a lovable backdrop to what was kind of what is ultimately kind of a story of transition and kind of the decay of some of these communities, as a result of these, degradation of minor league teams.
Yeah, there was something I think really special and kind of beautiful about that, especially when you do look at the sort of the corporatization of everything, basically. You look at the fact that you have individual major league players now making, it's not going to be long before we have the first $1 billion player. And yet you had the minor league teams that were being cut to save $700,000 a year to the major league parent. You look at NIL money now, which is basically sort of ruined, whatever innocence college sports may have at one point had. I don't think anyone was under the illusion that they had it recently, but it certainly hasn't gotten any better in that regard. And so this was kind of a place where it's as close to sort of a more pure experience as I think you're going to find. And the players loved it, because these are players who in some cases came from sort of Division III or mid-tier Division I schools, where in some cases they were playing in front of 75 people a night. And here they are in Batavia with 3,000 people. They're like local celebrities. The kids are asking them for their autographs. So it's a summer that they'll never forget. And the community in turn loves it too, because if you're a 7-year-old kid in Batavia, you don't know the difference between the muck dog player and, a major leaguer. To you, it's just another cool looking, big, strong athlete that's signing your autograph that you can play catch with before the game. And so it's like this pretty cool little symbiotic relationship that is very, very different from what you're going to find if you go to a major league ballpark, for example.
And when you started to set down to write, what are some rituals you like in place? When you're setting down to write, you're like, today's a writing day. Yeah, these are the things I like in place.
I would say that generally the big picture process is spending the first chunk of time gathering the material in the course of researching, reporting, interviewing. And then what I'll do is I'll take all of that, like I explained earlier, and I'll usually type it up in my notes each day. So at the end of the day, I'll kind of have a record of what it was that I observed and the interactions I had that day. I do a lot of outside research that doesn't make it into the book, but just books I need to read to sort of familiarize myself with the subject matter writ large. And so I'll take notes on those. And then, let's say it's like a 1 or 2 year project, usually like the first half of that. So let's say year 1, for example, will be the information gathering phase. And then I'll transition into the writing phase. And what I usually do for that is kind of just at the most basic level, I'll just kind of start cutting and pasting interview material into like a blank Word document. And that just kind of gives me like the frame or the skeleton of what will ultimately become the story. And then I'll start writing. And as far as the writing itself, I have 2 young kids. So, it's somewhat dependent on their schedules, but if they're at school or at daycare, I'll try to get as much done as I can during the course of the day when they're not around. And then the rest of it will have to kind of by default occur late at night once they're in bed. But I don't know. I've had this discussion with other parents. I don't know if having children, is from the writing standpoint, if it's a net positive and that it makes you more disciplined and efficient, or if it just makes everything a lot harder because you just have so much less time to do everything. Yeah. I can see both arguments. I'm not sure if I've yet concluded which is more accurate.
Yeah, and speaking with people on the show who have children, lots of people do it. It's a little bit of both. Like sometimes it's hard to get into a groove because you just never know, or it's like, you know what, I know I got 20 minutes. I'm just gonna hammer for 20 and see what I get done. And it's a little bit of both. Yeah.
And that's something that's hard to explain. So my wife, has a full-time job as well, and we both work remote. She does her job and I do this. And she'll always say, well, you have 20 minutes here or 30 minutes there, why can't you get any work done? And I try to, and I think maybe only writers would appreciate this, but I can't sit down and get any meaningful amount of writing done in a 20-minute window. I mean, it takes that long just to kind of turn that part of my brain on. And before and so, I don't know if I'll ever convince her of that, but what I will do to overcome that challenge, which is a real one when you have kids, is that's the time I'll use for like my administrative work, the emails, getting a hotel room in Batavia for the weekend, all the logistical stuff that you have to do. And then, I'll wait until I have a longer period of uninterrupted time to actually write, because I don't know, maybe other writers can do it, but the idea that you can do anything of any worth in a 20-minute window, I think is next to impossible.
Yeah, and these days focus is such a hard thing to come by. Just everything, you're just over-connected, social media, whatever. It can be very hard to focus. Phone is near you. You're like, oh, should I check my email or just check it?
Oh, it's terrible.
Whatever.
It's like, I don't know about you, but like it's a borderline addiction that I think
For sure.
can be crippling if you don't watch it. And it's only getting worse. And actually, the one little anecdote in the book, and I hope to maybe move in this direction, but I don't think it's a coincidence that the 2 people that I noticed had this kind of contagious sort of spiritual calm about them. The one thing they had in common is they did not own, and I don't think they even had a cell phone, much less an iPhone. And I don't think it's pure coincidence that's the case. And actually, I discovered that one night when I had planned to rendezvous with one of them at the ballpark, and I got there and I called the number. No answer, no answer, no answer. And then I see him sitting there, and I'm like, hey, how come you didn't answer? I've been calling you for the last half hour. And he said, what do you mean? And I said, well, I've been calling you. How come you didn't answer? He's like, well, I don't have a phone. That's my landline back home. I don't have a phone with me. And it just never even occurred to me that would be the case with anyone. But he was like one of the happiest people I've ever met. So yeah, I think, if there's something I learned from that, a takeaway, I think it's that I need to sort of help, or I need to do the best I can to discipline myself with that, with limiting the phone time as best I can.
Yeah, if I have the phone way out of my sight line, certainly more than arm's length away, and I have like over the ear noise canceling earmuffs, and when I put those on, I'm someone who's chronically distracted. I put those on, and it does kind of do this Jedi mind trick to me where I am able to get into a zone because there's context with it, and it helps. It blocks out the sound, and I find that helps me at least try to work uninterrupted as possible.
Oh yeah, no, it's something I mean, it got to the point where on smaller writing projects, I was noticing like this is insane. It's taken me like an hour to write a paragraph because every 2 seconds I'm checking Twitter, I'm checking ESPN.com, I'm checking this, I'm checking that. Like this is lunacy. Like you can't function like this. And so no, I think that's a real challenge that I think we have in today's day and age that we're all going to have to work on.
Well, fantastic. Well, we could talk about a lot of different threads in this all day, but I want to be mindful of your time and everything. But as you know, I like to bring these conversations down for a landing by asking the guest for a recommendation for the listeners, just like anything you're excited about that you want to share. So I'd extend that to you as we bring our conversation down.
Sure. My reading list is so insanely varied that it probably would shed no light on anything to share that because there's everything imaginable on my bedside table. But the one thing I would share with you and your listeners that I've been really into recently, because I do a lot of driving, when I'm on these different reporting trips, is I think it's called Massolit, Massolit. And my father actually told me about it, but it is a subscription service where you can have access to essentially college lectures, college courses on any topic under the sun. So right now I've been on this like Shakespeare binge. Many of the plays I had read at one point or another in my life or seen performed, but as I'm learning in the course of these lectures, like I probably had gleaned like 1/1000th of what, what was there to be discovered. And it's just been super cool. And I think it's something that just sort of as a writer, when you embark on one of these projects, there's always the risk that you just start going so far into these rabbit holes that it can just become kind of like one-dimensional. I think for me at least, there's a real sort of therapeutic value in just taking yourself completely out of the creative nonfiction world and whatever world it is that you're exploring for whatever project you're working on, and immersing yourself in like Macbeth, or Romeo and Juliet, as the case may be, just sort of for a form of sort of creative escape. So that's something that I've been doing a lot lately that I've found to be pretty enjoyable.
Oh, fantastic.
And helpful.
Oh, that's wonderful. Well, yeah, I think that's really, really great to kind of get out of our own genres and like our creative silos. So that's really great. Well, Will, thank you so much for carving out some time to come on the show and pitching the book my way. It was a wonderful read, and it really got me thinking about the state of baseball and capitalism and small town minor league baseball as we're about to lose our team for 70 years here in Eugene. They're moving, they're not contracted, but they'll be moving because they didn't get a stadium. But I could really relate to so many of the themes in the book. So I just want to say thank you for the work.
No, thank you for having me. I've been a long-time listener, so it's a real treat to get on the show.
Sweet. Swing. Awesome. It's the Wayne's World thing. You had to listen to the parting shot of the Katie Go episode to get the Wayne's World reference. Big thanks to Will and to you the listener, on this double feature Friday. We are moving along here. Moving along. As you get older, there's definitely this reluctance to take on new hobbies or new skills because they take a lot of time. And shit, we don't have a whole lot of time. And it can take years and years to reach mastery, or some facsimile of mastery. I didn't train as an audio guy, but on a whim in 2012 and 2013, when I officially launched the pod, I started experimenting, and now look at us. But I didn't start with a $300 or $400 microphone, a boom arm, an interface, or fancy software. It was a very gradual leveling up through constant repetition and trial and error after error after error. Now, as the Patreon gang knows, I've flirted with video and posited what video might mean, or whether or not to incorporate it as part of the podcast, following that trend or not. The short answer is no. There will never be a video component to the show. I'm not going to do that to you. I'm not going to do that to my guests. Though I have started having the camera on during the interviews. It leads to a different kind of energy. Historically, I've always had it off. And I've put it back on for now, just to maybe have that extra connection. Also, if they're having audio problems, or I can diagnose things a little better. You would think, shit, I got to take something out of the oven. Hold on. And my timer's going off. I got to take a little field roast thing out of the oven. Be right back. All right, I'm back. No video component to the show. That said, there's room to fuck around with video is a wing of the CNF Pod Expanded Universe. The CNF PEU. I've started fucking around with what I already have. So I'm not going super fancy. iMovie, free, my phone. Not free, but it's what I have. And that's it. I've watched a few videos on YouTube, but I don't want to get too skilled with iMovie because I'm ultimately going to level up to Premiere. And you might as well dive into the software you ultimately want to learn and then eventually master. So, even though there's going to be redundancies between the softwares, it's like you don't want to get so used to the interface of one if you're just going to learn from another. I don't know. Call me crazy. Now, the video interface is way more overwhelming than audio. More moving parts, quite literally more levels and layering in the program itself. But once I got going, just taking a little bite of the apple, just this little tiny, like a 30-second thing. Less than a minute. I don't know. It was pretty fun to play, the main clip and then overlaying B-roll and photos to something that, it looks a little better than something you would just like on a whim shoot on your phone and post to Instagram or something. And it's far from fully polished, professional or slick-looking YouTuber setups with 4K cameras and lighting and microphones with intercuts of licensed or pirated photos and B-roll of like The Office or Batman. I don't know. My point is that it's far too easy to get overwhelmed by a new thing. And I've learned more through the early doing of making tiny videos than I ever could from just watching tutorials or something like that. And I'm not doing it because it's like trendy to do it, but I think it's a good skill to learn. And I think video is the next frontier for platform building. And the cross-pollination of audio and video will further lend greater breadth to what I do here at CNF Pod HQ. As I see it, video is a chance to make goofy, irreverent mini movies that poke fun at being a writer, or kind of like vloggy type things that poke fun at being a writer, poke fun at myself. The video audience would be its own audience, but there'll be some bleed, and that's cool. But as I see it, it's just another wing of the platform, and maybe just a chance to fuck around. I've long resisted video mainly because it feels so complicated, but through the doing, it's becoming less so. And I've only made a half dozen or so little things. And I made a little book trailer that my marketing people at Mariner Books said was pretty good and liked it. And I've seen some other videos from authors, other Mariner book authors who've posted their little book trailer, things that they were encouraged to make. And mine's way better. But it's got to be fun. I hate hearing people feel like I need to start a podcast or a YouTube channel and just complain about that. You hear this a lot with comedians and podcasting. They're like, I got to start a podcast. No, you don't. In fact, if that's the attitude, then definitely don't. Don't do it because you feel like it's a trend or an obligation. Video for me goes all the way back to my high school days, believe it or not, in the late 90s. My pals, Pete and Keith primarily, we made these comedic detective movies on micro VHS tapes. We had handheld cameras that filmed right to these little cassettes. We had no idea what we were doing, but we made it work. And we just kind of learned on the go. And we just had a blast. It was some of the most fun I've ever had in my entire life. And a big regret I have in this life, believe it or not, of the many. Actually, I don't have that many. I have a few, and this is one of them, is not pursuing filmmaking in college. I kind of resent some of my teachers in high school who were kind of on the doorstep of retirement and were really checked out, like many of them. Not all of them, but a good chunk of them. And I resent them because they should have seen what we were doing, and they knew what we were doing. It was no secret. And maybe telling us, like, hey, maybe you should consider this path. Maybe you should consider a school that has a movie program or film program. And encourage us, like, oh wow, here's this thing that these kids are like clearly very passionate about and actually kind of talented at. The movies, even though like the film quality was garbage, they were actually pretty good for 17 and 18-year-old kids. They were pretty funny. So I've always been into making movies, and so making videos now, be it book trailers or just goofy writer videos with some polish, is all about having fun and learning a new skill that actually might keep me relevant over the next 10 years or 15 years. It's kind of just a Trojan horse to learning something new and diversifying the talent portfolio. Not that you have talent, but you know what I mean, like the skill portfolio, let's call it that. And audio has opened doors for me. I would never trained as an audio guy. It opened doors. It hasn't blown them open in one gust, but deadbolts began to unclick. And I could slip a credit card and through the thing and jimmy the door open. It's allowed me to platform hundreds of writers. Video might have, or it might similarly pave new roads. To quote Tom Petty, under my feet, babe, grass is growing. So you got to be nimble. You can't just be a writer, even though that's the meat and potatoes of it all. But you can't just be the one thing. The next frontier is dancing with AI, but I think I'm going to wait a few years to tap that maple tree. So stay wild, CNFers, and if you can't do, interview. See ya.